Howard, and he's going to be talking about implementing Cuban approaches to combat coronavirus and health disparities in the US. I think since we're running a bit behind time, I'm going to skip some of your introduction, Howard, but Howard has a long background in both medicine as a professor of public health and as an activist campaigning around Cuba. Was one of the first organizers of the Vence Ramos Brigade in 1969. So he's, with his background in Cuba Solidarity and his background in public health, he's a very ideal person to be starting this panel and moderating the rest of the session. So Howard, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. I want to give a big shout out to everyone on this call. It's really exciting that we have people not just from the United States, but from abroad. My name, as John said, is Howard Ehrman. I'm literally sitting in an office of our new community organization called Mi Villita, 1 mile from where May Day began, in Chicago. As my Afro-Cuban and Mexican wife taught me over 45 years ago, I first want to say mil gracias, especially to Ike, Gail, Cheryl, John, Cesar, and Elaine for everything that they've done, working together. And also mil gracias to my fellow panelists. We've met about 10 times since November, and I think we've developed a great team that I know is going to go on way beyond this conference. For those of you who've never done the 9-dot exercise, I'd really suggest you try to look it up and try to figure out how we're going to all think and work outside the box. It's a great thing to do, and particularly at this very moment. The title of this is not just a title, it's really the beginning of expanding and deepening our movement. 51 years ago, Illinois Black Panther Chairman Fred Hampton was scheduled to go on the first Vence Ramos Brigade. And one of the first things he asked us in Chicago was, what about the effect of the blockade on us here in the United States, stopping us from working with revolutionary Cubans here in Chicago and around the country? Yesterday and today's conference, created on the foundation of 60 years of solidarity work by thousands of individuals and organizations, is just the beginning of us really taking it to the US and other imperialists and capitalists around the country. At this historic moment, we must open up our hearts, minds, souls, and arms to each other and do things based on our history together, but actually going beyond our history. Going beyond anything we've ever done. Because at this moment, we're faced with the greatest worldwide human crisis since the 1917-1918 influenza pandemic that killed at least 50 to 200 million people. Right now, there's over 320,000 cases in the world, and 14,000 of our sisters and brothers have perished. While COVID-19 is not as deadly as the 1918 flu, it's reached more people in more places and light years faster than the other place. It's basically exposed the strength, human kindness, mutual aid, and solidarity of the revolutionary Cuban people and their government and people all over the earth. At the same time, it's exposed the weakness, lack of preparation, disorganization, and constant denial, inhuman efforts putting profits ahead of lives of millions in response of the so-called most powerful capitalist imperialist nations. I want to go over a few points about how what happened in the Cuban Revolution applies to where we're at today. Starting first, on the second day that Che and Fidel found each other and were together in the Sierra Maestra before the Comandancia, Che said to Fidel, we have to start now the revolutionary agricultural land reform of redistribution of land to the campesinos. Otherwise, we're not going to come close to winning this revolution. In July 1961, 2 years after the successful overthrow of Batista, Fidel basically told all 11 parties, some were much smaller than others, that they had to unite into one. And at that moment, the Integrated Revolutionary Organizations, ORI, was formed, which later became the Communist Party in 1965. The historic importance of the strategy to unify the Cuban people, and in particular rural campesinos and urban workers, through the extraordinary tactic of the 1961 literacy campaign. I think what everyone knows on this call is that the literacy campaign was not just to teach people how to read and write. It was to unite the campesinos and urban workers through basically learning from each other together. All the teachers who went out to the countryside learned as much from the campesinos as vice versa. Number 4, initiating the greatest act of international solidarity in human history in 1963, when Cuba sent its first doctors and other health workers to revolutionary Algeria. Now Cuba has more than 50,000 doctors in over 100 countries. In 1960, when Comandante Che Guevara wrote on revolutionary medicine, the foundation for what Cuba does today was set. The work that today is entrusted to the Ministry of Health and similar organizations is to provide public health services for the greatest possible number of persons, institute a program of preventive medicine, and orient the public to the performance of hygienic practices. Cuba is the #1 country in the world, according to the Sustainable Development Index, and the only country in the world to have a combined certification for both health and development. It was the first country in the world to stop vertical transmission of AIDS and HIV from mothers to their children before they were born. It has a lower infant mortality rate than the United States. It's invented hundreds of new medications and vaccines, including Simivax, which is being studied right there in New York for the last 5 years, which can basically help extend the life, decrease the symptoms of millions of people around the world who have lung cancer. It invented Hiraprot B, which is basically used by people all over the world, including in Cuba, and they could save 80,000 people in the United States from having amputations of their foot and leg from diabetes. In 1986, as we heard yesterday from the ambassador, it invented interferon alpha 2B. And in 2003, with the People's Republic of China, it built a factory in China, and China used this medication in combination with other antivirals to basically stop hundreds, maybe thousands of people from dying who were in the end stage of COVID-19. What did Cuba do, and what are the lessons to be learned for us? First, it decentralized its entire health system, including its hospitals, from almost all exclusively being in Havana to all 15 provinces. It implemented community-based door-to-door US public health based similarly to what we did in the United States starting in the 1880s in New York and Chicago, what London and people in England did 20 years before that. It implemented, to this day, door-to-door household census where primary care doctors, nurses, and during special campaign, promotores de salud, health promoters, basically know where everybody lives and who's at high risk. In other words, way before COVID came along, COVID-19, the Cubans knew exactly where the people who were most vulnerable lived and how to deal with them. It created both a horizontally and vertically integrated primary care, polyclinic, community hospital, teaching and research hospital system, unparalleled in the world. And something that maybe some people don't know, it's completely integrated with both committees in defense of the revolution and the entire national civil defense system, all three of whom, with other parts of the government, work together every May since 1986 to carry out Ejercicio Popular Medio Oro. In other words, it's a climate exercise. That's why everyone in Cuba knows exactly what to do when there's a hurricane, earthquake, and other things. So what are we to do? What lessons now can we apply in this moment of history where basically we have now reached a point where, because of not just the Trump administration, but every administration, at least since Jimmy Carter, every Democrat and Republican, including President Obama, who never replenished the N95 mask supply from 30 million to 300 million, even though he was told to do that starting in 2014. What are we going to do? Number one, we have to build the united front of all organizations who want to do something at this moment and not depend on our government. A united front for dual power, which means we have to do things in our communities, among ourselves, as well as put demands on the government. We have to develop a local, regional, national people's COVID-19 emergency declaration and response that has meat on it. That means on the ground mutual aid and solidarity. Those of you who may have seen the Democracy Now! Show, I'll send a link, put that in the chat later, a couple of days ago, know that there are thousands of people in every city and in some rural areas now basically providing food and medicine to people all over the United States. We have to develop neighborhood and citywide people's movement assemblies These come originally from the communes in Venezuela that were basically developed at the end of the 1990s and were brought to the United States first in the 2007 social forum. We have to do what people did in New York City during Occupy Sandy, where basically they went up into the development projects of people who had no elevators, no electricity, and went door to door and asked people what they need. We have to organize all the US health science students to work with us to demand that they be deputized as health workers under the existing legal authority of every state and most big county city health departments. Those of you in New York or who read the paper, the New York Times, know that Governor Cuomo has already started this, and so have some other governors. Health science students need to be teamed with on-the-ground frontline community-based organizations, especially in working class neighborhoods of color, labor unions, worker centers, racial, immigrant, and all social justice organizations. Once these students are trained and certified, which 10,000 medical students have already gone through this in Italy, 30,000 health science students in the United Kingdom are going through this, and now in France and many other countries. They would then also work appropriately under supervision in ERs and hospitals to relieve the thousands and thousands of overburdened sick health workers in the United States, particularly in New York City, but this will spread to everywhere else, including dozens of the Elam graduates at this very moment. They would work to develop educational resource and organizing leaflets door to door, and they would do a voluntary people's census of the most vulnerable. We need to start doing that now as long as we can go outside, which may not last too much longer. We need to develop phone number, email, social media contacts for assistance, for food, medicine, and transport. And last but not least, we need to put demands on all levels of the government. Full pay for all workers indefinitely, free testing and treatment, free food delivered to all under 250% of the poverty line, massive phone triage information system with specific protocols, algorithms that are staffed 24/7 by trained workers, free individual safe transport to ERs and hospitals for those with severe symptoms. And last but not least, implement the Korean War Emergency Production Distribution Pricing Act, which Trump has completely resisted. Even though he said he's done it, he has not. This is absolutely crucial for everyone in this country to have adequate supplies of everything from food to masks. And last, the question of personal protective equipment for every hospital worker. I'm not sure if everyone here is aware that in the last week, both the federal, state, and local governments have told every health worker in this country they cannot use N95 masks appropriately. They only can use them in certain situations because we don't have enough of them. This has tremendously increased the number of health workers that are sick, and they know this, are transmitting coronavirus back to the patients. So thank you very much. I want to take this opportunity, and I'll put this in the chat, to invite everyone and have you invite people to a special meeting tonight at 8:30 Eastern Time, 7:30 Central Time, 6:30 Mountain Time, 5:30 Pacific Time on the National People's Corona Emergency Declaration and Response. If you're interested, please send me an invitation, and thank you very much. So now I'd like to take the opportunity, it's my pleasure to introduce Brenda Lopez from Los Angeles, who's a member of the newly reformed US Hands Off Cuba. She's a young graphic designer at an independent newspaper in San Pedro, California, Random Lengths. Recently, Brenda led a delegation to Cuba's 12th International Environmental Conference held in Havana, consisting of 19 youth and chaperones, overwhelmingly Latinx. They did multiple workshops, worked directly with youth groups in Cuba, and are continuing to work together. The group presentations were from people from all over the world. They talked specifically about plastics and other things that have to do with oceans. And it's a real pleasure and honor to introduce Brenda Lopez.
Hi, thank you, Howard. As Howard mentioned, I am part of the LA US Hands Off Cuba Committee, and our delegation started after the committee participated in the Cuba Ambiente International Environmental Conference in La Habana last summer. The Cuban Environmental Youth Group, Jóvenes Ambientalistas Cubanos, along with the Acuario Nacional and the University of Havana Marine Science Center, invited us to participate and present a workshop on ocean plastic pollution. But beyond that, since high school, I've been educating my underserved Spanish-speaking community on the dangers of climate change and what we can do at home to reduce our impact, since data shows us that working-class communities are the hardest hit when it comes to so-called natural disasters, as we're seeing now. While American politicians are still refusing to acknowledge climate change, Cuba has once again led the way in tackling the impact in a comprehensive and humanitarian way. Yet both countries face similar environmental problems. Extreme climate changes include drought, flooding, sea level rising, and erosion of beaches and coastlines worldwide. This is why ending the inhumane 6-decade-old blockade is so important. If the two nations had good relations, it would open the door for scientific and humanitarian collaboration that could help us educate our citizens and develop scientific breakthroughs much faster. In Cuba and the US, hurricanes occur, but the countries respond very differently. Cuba is primarily concerned with saving lives, while the US is concerned with saving money and properties, as we witnessed with Hurricane Katrina. The US refused to take Cuban assistance while doing little to help those impacted. In California, we are very underprepared for natural disasters of pandemics like we are seeing now. Cuba, on the other hand, is very prepared when it comes to climate change preparedness prevention. On April 25th, 2017, Cuba approved a 100-year plan called Tarea Vida to address climate change. The name in itself, Project Life, shows the humanitarian approach that Cuba takes. The comprehensive climate change prevention program has a short-term, long-term, and long-range goals. The ambitious and complex project includes 11 tasks. I will only be discussing a couple of the tasks, but I can send over my presentation to anyone who wants to learn a bit more about the other task. Task 4 concentrates on improving their water infrastructure. Collaboration with California on this topic would be highly beneficial to both countries since we both face water shortage problems. Leaking drainage systems, reduced rainfall, and greater evaporation and deteriorating water quality all contribute to Cuba's water shortages. Cuba's water treatment plants are effective, but because of the blockade, they often lack chemicals to purify enough water, and importing from other countries is very expensive. With no blockade, the countries could collaborate on advanced water infrastructure projects and assist the world where nearly 25% of the global population drinks fecally contaminated water containing bacteria, protozoa, and viruses that cause a variety of diseases in humans and is responsible for about 90% of diarrheal deaths worldwide. Working together, we can, in the spirit of Cuba's international medical teams of white coats, as Fidel called them, we can ensure that future generations have a secure and safe drinking water source. Task 10 also focuses on water problems, but encourages a culture that promotes water conservation. The US can be better guided by Cuba's example in public educational campaigns since the US faces long drought periods, which are already worsening with global warming. Educating people is the best way to plant the seed. Task 5 focuses on deforestation. Trees are cut to use the land for livestock and agriculture, deriving tree oils, or for the use of firewood for lack of electricity, causing loss of habitat for many species. This is especially important in light of the suspected wild bat to pangolin to human origin of coronavirus. In the scientific world, it is well known that deforestation is one of the main reasons that wild species end up closer to humans, increasing our risk of animal to human disease transmission. Add that to human consumption of wild protein animals and population density, and you have infectious disease spread. Scientists estimate that a 10% yearly increase in forest loss leads to a 3% increase in malaria. Other infectious diseases associated with deforestation include yellow fever, dengue, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, Nipah virus, and Lyme disease. In fact, 60% of the new infectious diseases, including coronavirus and HIV, as well as Ebola, originated in forest-dwelling wild animals. Because ecosystems are interconnected, worldwide deforestation, whether it be Amazon loss or clear-cutting forests, causes a domino effect. Trees are nature's air purifiers, and without them, atmospheric carbon dioxide increases along with ocean acidification, which is destroying our marine ecosystems. The task has a great importance for the US and all nations. Cuba and the US could collaborate on disease containment. Coronavirus demonstrates the inadequacy of the for-profit healthcare system of the US and the capitalist world versus Cuba's response and internationalism. Cuba can assist us in preparing for future pandemics that the climate crisis and environmental destruction will only increase. We must work together. Task 8 implements climate change adaptation that includes projects linked to food security, renewable energy, agriculture, fishing, health, and tourism. This task covers many sectors, but I want to focus on agriculture and food security, since salinization, the increasing salinity of soil, is one of the most challenging environmental issues being faced today, threatening our economically important crops. Some of the many causes include the use of high salt fertilizers, irrigation, and even ice melting road salt. Global warming will also continue to increase salinization, and as droughts become more extreme, water will become scarcer for humans and crops. Agriculture is really important since the West makes up half of the market value for the country's annual output. For example, in 2018, California produced 80% of the world's almonds, and which were valued at $5.6 billion. In the next 10 to 15 years, salinization will be exacerbated by the climate crisis. As droughts become more extreme, the conditions will make water scarcer and the crops become thirstier. Salinity will become a far more burdensome obstacle to overcome. The threat to our food supply and the loss of money is so obvious in this task that maybe this could be our key to lifting the blockade and allowing collaboration between the two countries. Lastly, Task 11 focuses on managing the international financial resources used to carry out these tasks. Without sanctions and the blockade, Cuba and its people would not be struggling economically. If anything, we can take Cuba as an example to be better prepared for climate change catastrophes. Cuba faces more extremes with far fewer resources, but put a priority on human life, something we can learn from before ecosystems completely collapse and the survival of humanity is threatened. The UN has repeatedly cited Cuba as a global model for risk reduction, yet the US annually vetoes the UN vote on ending the blockade. Cuba overall is one of the most sustainable countries in the world, with the highest human development score. An investment in our future will save us a lot of money. This means reducing consumerist habits, thinking globally, sharing resources often extracted from poor countries, educating each other, and giving back to the world as Cuba does to save lives. I want to close with a quote from Elsa Perez, who is the Minister of Science, Technology, and the Environment for the Cuban government, from her opening remarks at the Cuba Ambiente conference in La Habana. The very existence of life on planet Earth is threatened. That is a call to action, to ending the US blockade of Cuba, to normalizing US-Cuban relationships, and to working together. Thank you.
Okay. Wow, that was incredible, Brenda. Thank you so much. And I wanted to just take the opportunity to let people know that 227 people so far are on this webinar, and we're really happy to see everyone. I also want to ask myself and the rest of the presenters that when we're not speaking, to turn off both the audio and the video. I forgot to say that, so thank you very much to Gail, who reminded me of that. And also, I want to let people know, I don't know when this will happen, but we have a wonderful person, I don't know if he's on right now, named Cesar, who has been keeping up our website for the conference. And so all of these presentations that include things in Word, PowerPoint, and probably other types of software will be posted on the conference website sometime in the next few weeks. Next, I want to take the opportunity to introduce Mildred Millie Guzman Young from the Greater Hartford, Connecticut Cuba Coalition. Millie works in the adult foster care system in Connecticut, conducting home visits primarily to Puerto Rican families in Massachusetts. She also works at Central Connecticut State University in the Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Center. She has obtained her bachelor's in biology from that same university. Millie has lived both in Puerto Rico and in Connecticut. She basically was in Cuba and in Puerto Rico within a few weeks of each other right after Hurricane Maria. And beside her general background, she has an incredible way to compare what happened, both in terms of preparation and response to hurricanes in Puerto Rico, in Cuba, and certainly the situation in Connecticut. She organized her first protest against the tuition increase at the same university where she works, and worked in the anti-war and immigrant rights movement. She was an active member of the counter recruitment at Hartford County High School. She helped organize against Promesa, the Promesa law in Puerto Rico, lifting the blockade in Cuba, and fought to free political prisoner Oscar Herrera. So we're really happy to have Millie. I think she's going to segue beautifully with what Brenda just said, and take it away, Millie.
Thank you, Howard. Can you hear me, Howard?
We can hear you.
Okay, great. While I'm getting the screen on so that I can switch. I can go ahead and start while
So it's loading.
it's loading. So how does climate change affect natural disasters? That's the question that I open up with. As the Earth's climate is warmed by increasing levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, more intense hurricanes will occur. Global surface temperatures are increasing according to NASA and GISS. This can lead to more drought and more water evaporates into the atmosphere. The National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration reports rising ocean surface temperatures, which can also increase wind speeds in tropical storms. Sea levels are rising and will reach higher grounds than ever before. Scientists say that extreme weather events that we've been seeing lately around the globe are likely due to climate change caused by humans. So I was looking at disaster preparedness in the United States compared to Cuba. So in Connecticut, we have a website. It all boils down to us having a website. In 2011, the Connecticut Department of Public Health revised an emergency preparedness guide. They had an original website, and they and a 30-second radio announcement, another 30-second announcement that's on TV. There's a WAHA emergency code. This is what our people are given to fend for themselves in these natural disasters. The website is how to prepare for natural disasters and for biological, chemical, nuclear, radiological, and pandemic flu emergencies. The website is informative, but it's not going to do the job. It's not going to be the most effective way to save lives. It's nothing compared to what Cuba is doing. We are in the middle of a pandemic, and I have not heard any of these radio commercials or, sorry, these radio announcements or television announcements here in Connecticut. Massachusetts and Louisiana have similar websites for disaster preparedness. Puerto Rico has the same thing too, and they share it with the US and Virgin Islands. They get one website for both. But basically, this is what we are given. These are the tools that we're given to survive. It's not enough. The programs for disaster preparedness were funded largely by public health emergency preparedness grants that were given by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So what I'm learning is, I have to switch sheets. Hang on a second. I'm trying to move to the next one here, but it's slow. It's still loading. Hang on a second. I'm sorry that I'm stalling because sorry about that. I'm gonna download it again. Hopefully. Okay, I'm gonna technical problem. No, Steve, hang on a second.
I'm sorry, Millie, were you still doing your presentation? Millie? Hello?
He's muted.
Howard, I'm so sorry that my presentation kept loading and it never stopped, so I had to shut it down to start it up again. Give me 1 second.
Oh, sure. Okay, thank you. Millie, would it be okay if we moved on to Ramon and then come back to you? Would that be okay with you?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, very good. So let me go ahead and introduce Ramon. Ramon, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hello, Howard.
Good. So let me introduce, very happy to have Ramon Espinosa with us. Ramon and I got to know each other on a IFCO Pastors for Peace caravan less than a year and a half ago. It was a wonderful trip, of course, organized by that organization that's been doing that great work for years. His topic is Of the Community or By the Community, Police, Criminal, and Restorative Justice in Cuba and Hartford. Ramon earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science with a minor in Latin American Studies from the University of Connecticut and obtained a Master's of Arts degree, honors in Graduate Scholarship in Public Policy from Trinity College. He has a long history of working directly on the issue of criminal and restorative justice, including working with incarcerated men and women on educational programs and job readiness. He's been to Cuba twice. He conducted ethnographic research in Havana and Pinar del Rio. Ramon has also traveled to Puerto Rico to study social work and met with leaders of the Vieques civil rights movement. Currently, he works for the University of Connecticut, where he provides academic and career counseling to students, encouraging their interest in higher learning. Take it away, Ramon.
Okay, thank you so much, Howard, and thank you so much for to the organizers of this international conference for allowing me to speak. I do have a PowerPoint. I'm not sure if people could see it. I am going to be speaking a little bit quickly, only for the interest of time, but I do encourage people to contact me if you have more questions and whatnot, and I'll make sure the organizers have my my personal information to give to those who are interested in speaking. But as Howard mentioned, I have worked in a variety of things that will allow me to sort of compare and contrast what's sort of the criminal approaches to sort of prison systems and policing in the states, more specifically Connecticut, with that of Cuba. So really quickly, for those of you that may not know, the state of Connecticut is a small state in New England that forms part of the United States. And the city of Hartford is the capital of which I live, and most of my experience comes from. I will be drawing on research information as well as personal experience in my talk. The city of Hartford, Connecticut has about a population of about 124,000 approximately. 44% of those are Hispanic or Latino, 35% are Black and African Americans, and 14% are white. It's also important to note that the city of Hartford is one of the poorest cities in the nation, and definitely one of the poorest cities in the state of Connecticut, which is one of the wealthiest. The People's Republic of Cuba, as I'm sure many people, if not all of those in the webinar know, is an independent sovereign country with a very different economic and political system, which is going to come to bear in the comparison contrast. But moving on to historical perspectives in terms of criminal justice policy in Connecticut. During the 1970s, there was an increase in crime in Connecticut, and in response to this, the General Assembly passed sort of adopted, the state of Connecticut adopted a very punitive measures. So more prisons were built, and sort of laws were passed that were a little bit draconian. So to give you an example, about the inmate population grew from 4,000 in 1980 to about 16,000 in 1999. You know, with the explosion of, or sort of the expansion and the creation of new prisons, this also created an expensive penal system. Attitudes started to change in about 2000. The Connecticut legislature during the 2001 session passed a law giving judges flexibility to go around the mandatory minimum sentencing so long as they had good reason for doing so. And they also sort of promoted programming to help the incarcerated, those ex-offenders to sort of combat recidivism. So I worked, just to give you an example, the STRIDE program, which operated in Quinebaug Valley Community College, was a collaborative effort between the Labor Department, Social Services, and Welfare to Work. That's where I worked, and I worked specifically in Corrigan and Rogowski, which was a sort of a prison, a maximum prison, and then I worked in Bridgeport Community Correctional, which is kind of like a county jail. I'll explain the difference between that in a bit. But there's still, even with this shift, several problems, especially when it comes to recidivism. The latest study from the state of Connecticut shows, when focusing on ex-offenders who have a sort of sex offense, within 5 years of their release, 79% were re-arrested, 69% were convicted of a new crime, and 50% returned to prison with a new sentence. Research data also shows that those that have the formerly incarcerated face many challenges in our society. Chief among them are a history of substance abuse, low levels of education, reduced ties to family, and that's a very important point as the way sort of the emphasis that Cuba places on family, and limited amount of work experience, and more specifically discrimination in the labor market due to the prior conviction. So moving on to Cuba, I wanted to start off with a quote, just to give you and this quote is from Ms. Sophia Elijah, who's an advocate of criminal justice reform, and it's an accomplished attorney and educator. And it reads, "I was really struck by everything that was so very different from my experiences as a criminal defense lawyer in the United States, visiting clients in prison." This is when she went to Cuba. "When we drove up to facilities, I kept looking for what I was used to here. High stone walls, lots of barbed wire, guarded towers, guards with assault weapons, and I didn't see any of that. We pulled up to a building that looked like a large elementary school. And when we entered the building, there was no metal detectors. No one was checking my bag to look for weapons or contraband, and there was no sign-in book. Nobody was in uniform. You didn't have this demonization and stereotyping that we have here, where incarcerated people are ostracized. They're like untouchables." And having worked in facilities, this observation is interesting in that I have had people that sort of come from the outside to visit family in the inside communicate to me that they do feel like they're also prisoners, and there's an alienation that happens there that is just not a friendly environment even to the visitor. And this is actually a very important thing that we'll be able to talk about in a bit. Lessons from Cuba that we could maybe learn from, or that'd be interesting to take a look at. These are practitioners. Their families are an integral part, integral part of prisoners' rehabilitation. Prisoners incarcerated in the province in which they live, it facilitates regular contact between prisoners and their families. Families are incorporated through joint counseling into the rehabilitation process. This is actually very important. I'll just give you an example from my professional experience. When I worked in Corrigan and Rogowski, going back, and that's a place called in Uncasville, Montville. It's about an hour drive from Hartford, Connecticut. So as I mentioned earlier, Hartford is a very poor city. Some people don't have reliable transportation, and the public transportation system in Connecticut is not as sophisticated as you'd find in places like New York or Boston, which creates a very difficult situation for people that want to sort of visit relatives. So, but in Cuba, the prisoners are incarcerated in a province that's close to where they live because they want to sort of facilitate the sort of family sort of engagement. If you want to sort of know more about the way they do things, or at least get an idea of how they do things, I do recommend people to read The Cuban Five, Their Lives Within the U.S. Working Class. It's a book by Pathfinder Press that through interviews shows how social workers work with the incarcerated. So for example, it may be common for a social worker to know the family and the children, the family of a person who's incarcerated, as well as the name of the children, and sort of inquire about how they're doing and let them know how the prisoner's doing. My observations, having worked with counselors in prisons and in jails, that some of them mean well, but because the caseload is so high and because there's such an emphasis on safety, that it's just really making sure that they have certain goals, like certain documents and whatnot upon their release, or maybe communicating messages. You don't have that sort of human element and sort of to it. Another important lesson that we could sort of look at, that would be interesting to look at, is employment. Prisoners in Cuba are not obligated to work. In Connecticut, they are highly encouraged, and if they were to turn down a position, then they could be penalized for it. Whereas in Cuba, it seems like it's optional. Moreover, they are compensated in Cuba for their labor at the same wage that free workers are compensated, who are not incarcerated. In Connecticut, that is not the case. Workers, at least last time I checked, that work in the prisons make very, very minimum, sort of very less than minimum wage, I believe. Also, interesting lessons from Cuba's approach to incarceration. We could look at programming, alternatives to incarceration forms. The way that they do their forms of sort of probation, conditional release, and suspended sentences covers all defendants sentenced up to 5 years. The recidivism rate is for prisoners released pursuant to this, to use of alternatives to incarceration, is less than 15%. And there's other programs as well, but I'll just move forward because I want to make sure I get all this in. The city of Hartford, and this is now moving to my experience with the Civilian Police Review Board. The Civilian Police Review Board acts to review investigations of citizen complaints against police conduct and to make recommendations to the chief of police in connection therein. This was done through a consent decree in the city of Hartford. And so I was the chair and the secretary. I was in the board for about maybe sort of 9 years or so. We did do some good work. We were able to generate a list of Hartford police officers with sustained civilian complaints. But there were some controversies. Out of the 5 out of the required 9 appointed members, there was a requirement of 9. We only had 5. The board had to cancel meetings due to quorum issues, and part of this was negligence or really not caring by the. It's an appointed process where the members are appointed by the mayor and the city council, and the elected officials at the time just didn't really put that much emphasis to it, to appointing new members, so people would move on and whatnot. And but what wound up happening is that there were some very high stakes, sort of very serious incidents that happened in the community relating to police officers' interactions with crime, with people and sort of criminal sort of moments. And the Civilian Police Review Board members were removed in the middle of a high-profile investigation. They were replaced days after formally asking the city for a list of 19 officers who didn't cooperate with state police investigators in a case that involved alleged police abuse. So what we could learn from this, and this gets very technical. It's really an example of how communities don't sort of the failure of community organizations, and we could look to Cuba to see how they do things and whatnot. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ramon. That was an incredible presentation. I hope everybody got to see the PowerPoint. And as I wrote in the chat, all of these presentations in the next few weeks, I'm sure will be put up onto the conference website. If you wouldn't mind turning off your video, please, Ramon. Next, I'm really happy to present a brother who has done incredible work for a decade. Malcolm Sachs is the national co-coordinator of the Venceremos Brigade. As someone who's going to be 73 years old in a couple of months, I'd have to say that I am so happy that Malcolm and other people, he may not consider himself young, but a lot younger people than we were in the 60s and 70s, have really reinvigorated, expanded, and done an incredible job on the Venceremos Brigade. Beside that, Malcolm is a New York City public high school teacher and a member of the New York Collective of Radical Educators, which is New York Core, Teachers Unite, and the MORE, Movement of Rank and File Educators Caucus of the United Federation of Teachers. Since 2009, he has served as one of the national coordinators of the VB, Venceremos Brigade, which recently organized a contingent of 150 plus people to travel to Cuba from the US for its 50th anniversary, of which I was happy to be one of those. Thank you so much, Malcolm, for being here, and we really look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here and very grateful to all the organizers and everyone in attendance. I'm going to speak about the relationship of Cuba's education system to the struggles we have in New York and the rest of this country around education. You know, I want to contextualize what I'm saying as we had been preparing our panel for the last few months, and then this crisis hit, and I've seen it's coming up in the chat, and there's this question of like, what do we do in this moment versus a broader structural critique? And of course, we know that the US hasn't had a socialist revolution. I don't think any of us on this panel are under the illusion that we're close to that in this moment. But the crisis that we're living through right now is revealing many of the structural failings of capitalism. And it's demanding immediate action at the same time. I don't think there's a contradiction between analyzing both. And Howard mentioned specifically the concept of dual power. which I think is really at the heart of what we're all talking about, right? How do we make demands of the institutions in this country to make reforms, to respond to this and other crises, while also doing the work in our communities to set up parallel formations in order to take care of one another and fulfill our needs. And so I'm going to try to touch both sides of that in terms of education. Of course, the perspectives and priorities and approaches of the Cuban government are very different from those of the US. And so any discussion of what we could take from Cuba in terms of education, what we're missing out on, does start from there, just in terms of how much investment there is in public education. Cuba spends something like 13% of their GDP on education, while the US spends about 5%. In Cuba, the concept of student debt does not exist, where here we have a total of around $1.5 trillion in student debt. Ironically, the same number of dollars that were just given in a bailout to the banks could have wiped out all student debt in this country. And in general, the Cuban population is cared for in much different way than the US population, from childcare to food to healthcare to housing. Just last week in New York City, we went through the process of shutting down the largest public school system in the country, 1.1 million students. And as the government realized that they needed to shut down the schools, there was this simultaneous realization that they had no plan to deal with all of the provision of basic needs that so many schools function for, especially for poor and working class communities here, where schools are really only secondarily for education. And their primary purpose seems to be actually, making sure that students have food and clean clothes and the chance to connect and get some social and emotional support. So as Cuba's facing this similar crisis, not on the same scale so far, as folks have said, they're much more prepared. Their schools are still open, but I think we can be sure that even if the disease did spread to the extent that they need to close schools, they won't be asking questions about how the kids are going to be fed or housed or clothed, or how they're going to see a social worker or a nurse in the midst of this crisis. So all that as context, and then I'm going to just say a few things specifically around literacy as the area where I think maybe our communities are most affected by the blockade, the area in terms of education. So I'm just anecdotally, as a 12th grade teacher working in the Bronx and Brooklyn for the past 8 years, I've never had a group of students where the majority were reading on grade level. On the contrary, I would say I've always had a significant chunk of students reading at or around 3rd grade level, which really means students are still learning how to read. And many students have told me also, of course, that their parents or guardians don't know how to read or write either. This was the focus of a little campaign that some of my students took on at a school that I worked in, where they were demanding that the school provide free literacy classes for parents. And this correlates with what we know nationally. 30 million adults in the US do not read above a 3rd grade reading level. The children of those adults have a 75% chance of also reading at a very low reading level. We know that this is disproportionately affecting poor working class children, Black and brown and indigenous children in this country, with higher rates of academic failure, higher rates of behavioral or disciplinary action, special ed referral, and dropout. We also know, connecting back to what Ramon is touching on, 75% of people in prison in the US are classified as low literacy. And then connecting to the healthcare system, it's estimated that $230 billion in healthcare costs are related to low literacy, as such large numbers of US Americans can't read well enough to understand their healthcare information. I think we'll be feeling the consequences of that even more acutely right now in the context of this crisis. I'm seeing it as many of my students and their families are trying to sort through tons of information about what's going on, where and how to access help, but don't necessarily have been equipped with the skills to do so. In contrast, of course, Cuba is known as a worldwide leader in education and especially in literacy. We all saw, I'm sure, the fiasco around Bernie Sanders saying a couple words that were positive about the literacy campaign in Cuba. Howard mentioned it earlier. In 1961, Cuba mobilized hundreds of thousands of young people to teach folks how to read and write there. They brought the literacy rate to 96% in 1 year. And since then, it's gotten to virtually 100%. And then, as we know how Cuba does, they didn't hoard those resources or try to keep their achievements and accomplishments for themselves. But just like with doctors, Cuba has been sending educators around the world throughout the revolutionary process, specifically using the program that they developed for literacy called Yo Si Puedo, in English, Yes I Can. It's been expanded and exported to 30 countries, reaching more than 10 million people. And this is, of course, not reaching the communities that could use it in the United States due to the blockade. We're talking about a program that is highly tailored to the specific needs of a community, linguistically, culturally, and otherwise. A program that's available in many, many languages, including indigenous languages, and one that has been shown to work. As I mentioned, 10 million people worldwide. Perhaps the most successful case, Venezuela, implemented the program in 2003. It reached 1.5 million Venezuelans in 2 years, and the United Nations in 2005 declared the country free of illiteracy. So I know in recent years, there have been visits organized of Cuban educators to come to the United States and speak to communities, and there is interest, there is demand in communities who are dealing with problems of literacy to have access to this program. And so as we think about how is the blockade impacting us in this direction, this is a major area where we would benefit. So what could it look like for educators, students, families to organize here in order to have access to this program and in order to have access to collaboration with Cuban teachers and students as well? I'm going to leave it there.
So one incredible presentation after another. Millie has just told me that she's ready to continue her presentation. So Millie, please take it away. We would
Okay,
just ask
thanks, Malcolm. That was great. Okay. Okay, so I left off basically here where we are left to fend for ourselves, because in Connecticut, in Puerto Rico, in Massachusetts, and I'm assuming that in other states, all we have is a website to go to where we read about how do we save ourselves. There's no real preparedness like they have in Cuba, where they actually conduct these exercises twice a year and practice. I'm gonna go to the next screen here. Sorry. So we can see the lack of hurricane preparedness in New Orleans, where you see when Hurricane Katrina hit, you could see the people were on the roofs for over a week, asking for help. This picture says the water is rising, please help. And the same thing in Puerto Rico, you see in 2017, in Humacao, Puerto Rico, people were asking for water. We are not prepared. There is no hurricane preparedness. We're left to fend for ourselves with these websites that they refer us to go to. So in New Orleans, residents were frustrated at the lack of government response to Katrina and flooding from the levees. The local government had no flood plan, and evacuation was ordered too late. They only had less than a day to leave. Residents were sent to unsafe domes where without food, water, without security, and without sanitary conditions. So the lack of hurricane preparedness contributed to the loss of 1,464 lives in New Orleans. In Puerto Rico, relief efforts came too little too late. The same thing. People reported that there was no water, there was no food. Mothers were giving their babies dirty water and they had diarrhea. People were dying. Babies died in incubators because of lack of electricity. Elderly died because their insulin was not refrigerated for so long, and people that needed renal dialysis also died because of lack of electricity. The people started realizing the government response was not there. So in the diaspora, we were realizing that FEMA was blocking the food and water that we were giving. I went to Cuba for the Che celebration of the 50th anniversary of, it was a commemoration for Che Guevara, and my daughter and I went to Cuba, and when we came back 2 weeks later, the food and water was rotting away in the San Juan docks. So the government clearly failed us in Puerto Rico as a colony of the US, and in New Orleans, Louisiana, as we can see. Another few pictures. In the USA and its colony, Puerto Rico, there is no adequate preparation and response to disasters. In New Orleans, hurricane response was very slow. When the evacuation was ordered by the mayor, he didn't give people enough time to leave. So elderly, sick, physically and mentally disabled, pregnant women, and children, these are the people that suffer the most. Then they hired a company that 2 days later provided evacuation, 2 days after the hurricane. As you can see in the photo on the left, this is in New Orleans when everyone was leaving. That was the evacuation after 2 days. In Puerto Rico, you see 2 years after Hurricane Maria. So the recovery process is also slow. In Puerto Rico, I'm gonna say that FEMA blocked supplies because I'm part of a group called Puerto Rico Rise Up, and we had somebody that donated a jet, and so the medication that Yale University, not the university, the hospital, the medication that they donated was gonna be sent in this airplane, and FEMA blocked it. Why would they block medical supplies? We were getting blocked from FEMA, from Rosello, and also when I asked the military why they weren't delivering water and the food, they said they had no direct orders. So when it comes to disasters, we are left behind, and we need to come up with another plan, because with Plan B and Plan C, because Plan A is not working, we can't depend on the government. This is why we need to get rid of the blockade. If we could establish connections with Cuba, who, by the way, offered both Katrina victims and Hurricane Maria victims, they offered not only electricians, but also doctors to come, but the United States did not allow it, basically. So they're not helping us, and then they're not allowing our brothers and sisters in Cuba to help us. They're letting us just die. When I was at the conference for the Che commemoration, I went to the conference and went to a panel where they were talking about Cuba's hurricane preparedness program that they have. It's organized by the civil defense. And so I was amazed at their preparation. When I went outside to thank the people who brought us there, the tour guides that took us there, I couldn't even get the words out of my mouth, because at that moment I realized that my people were dying. We lost so many lives, almost 5,000 lives, when this program exists, this plan to save lives. Instead, in Puerto Rico, they were focusing on contracts, on what they can get from Puerto Rico, instead of trying to save us. They were looking at the caves that are there and the copper that they could get out of the caves. And then they had bidding wars. They wanted to privatize the electric company at that time. So they were not allowing the electric company workers to go out and help the people and fix the grid. They were letting the electricians, they were forcing them to stay in the facility to make the company look like it was failing, so that they would privatize it. So now it is privatized. Let me go to the next screen. Disaster preparedness in Cuba. Despite limited resources and the U.S. blockade, Cuba excels in education, literacy, and medicine. The success in the above three areas that I mentioned has a huge impact on public awareness and participation and disaster preparedness. The most important disasters affecting Cuba caused minimal loss of lives, whereas in the United States and in Puerto Rico, we suffered great losses. Disaster preparedness in Cuba, hurricanes and tropical storms. Hurricane Flora in October of 1963 in Cuba caused 1,200 deaths. And this made the new leaders of Cuba, Fidel Castro, to make a change, and they developed the National Civil Defense System. Cuba's I can't even say the word, sorry, Meteorological Institute shares data with US scientists and projects storm tracks. 72 hours before a storm hits, national media issues it an alert, while civilian protection committees check evacuation plans and shelters. Hurricane awareness is taught in schools. They have two practices every year, two drills. The state runs television and civil defense authority broadcasts to the people to inform them and instruct them on measures that they need to take to save themselves. Residential blocks have a person taking a census on who is being evacuated and to which shelter. They go door to door and they get out the elderly, the sick, the pregnant women, and children. They make sure that those members of the community are evacuated first, the ones in more need. And so this is how Cuba saves lives, door to door. Nobody gets left behind. They do this in 4 stages. And so in stage 1, they have the civil defense structure. It's where they place an alert and the media begins broadcasting the warnings. Stage 2, it occurs 48 hours before the storm. This is done by the National Civil Defense. In each municipality, they begin to organize hurricane preparation efforts, such as sending students home from schools. Shelters are inspected and supplied, and evacuations begin. Stage 3 is once the hurricane makes landfall, the media continues to provide coverage of the hurricane and attempts to maintain lines of communication. After the hurricane has passed, then we move on to stage 4. Return to their homes. after they have been certified as sound by the DCN. Rescue operations and tallies of damages begin. So everyone from their homes and bring them to a safe location like a university or a strong building. They provide entertainment for them. They also bring pets. They don't leave the pets behind. And then after they provide entertainment, they also have doctors there helping them. And in the meantime, they have the civil defense group in that stayed behind in the danger zone to then help fix up all the damage that the hurricane created. And once all the homes are safe, then they bring the people back to the community. It takes love to put yourself in harm's way and do this for your people. Move on to the next one. Disaster preparedness in Cuba. And the National Civil Defense coordinates all levels of Cuba's national disaster planning, preparation, response, and recovery. The Cuban health system plays a key role in this. The National Civil Defense has the goal of protecting people and state resources based on the 4 phases: prevention, readiness, answer, and recovery. In the event of a storm or a pandemic, the heads of every institution, schools, hospitals, hotels, considered members of the Cuban Civil Defense Force are responsible for the well-being of the people around them. The President of the Republic, cabinet members with responsibilities for all relevant departments, and all other military, statutory, and administrative authorities are on the ground in the area overseeing the operations. Oops, sorry about that. Howard, would you like me to mention the action plans? Or should we save that for?
No, go right ahead, because this is your last slide, right?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, I think this is
So-
really, really important. Go right
So-
ahead and then we'll finish up.
So for the action plan, I think it would be great to prepare a fact sheet to be used by Cuba solidarity groups like ours and others that explains how Cuba prepares for and responds to disasters such as hurricanes and earthquakes, contrasting Cuba's achievements in this area with recent experiences in the United States and its colonies like Puerto Rico. Distribute the fact sheets widely, but especially in communities that have been impacted by disasters and suffered consequences of negligence on the part of the United States government and its agencies like FEMA, Puerto Rico, Florida, like these areas, New Orleans. Publicize the fact sheet that the fact that Cuba's offers to provide assistance were rebuffed by the United States. Assistance with medical doctors and also with electricians, and to raise the demands that Cuban emergency officials be invited to tour the US and Puerto Rico to share their expertise, and that similar offers of aid from Cuba in future disasters be welcomed. This is the demand that we need to make. We also encourage local community organizations to emulate Cuba by drawing up plans that will involve all finding safe places and refuge in the event of a disaster with or without help from federal, state, or local government agencies, which we know clearly that we cannot depend on. And this last picture is a sculpture by Andres Gonzalez, and it's at the National Cuban Civil Defense Building in the Casablanca suburb of Havana, Cuba. I don't know if you can see, but these are hands. On the bottom rock, they sculpted hands, and then on the top one, they're like pulling each other, holding each other, saving each other.
So I really want to thank Millie for an incredibly important presentation like everyone else's. I think the details of exactly how the system of civil defense works in Cuba and how it could be applied in the United States are very important. Next, last but not least, is Aislinn Pulley. who's the co-executive director of the Chicago Torture Justice Center with over 20 years of organizing experience. Aislinn has been to Cuba multiple times. She was the 2016 National Network on Cuba featured speaker at the University of Illinois at Chicago at their national conference in November of 2016. She's worked on a variety of campaigns, including Reparations Now, to pass the historic 2015 reparation ordinance for survivors of Chicago police torture. Aislinn organized a 10-member Black Lives Matter contingent, ages 10 to 70 years old, to go as part of the Chicago Cuba Coalition, participating in the first U.S. delegation to the Cuba International May Day Brigade in 2017. I'm sure we're going to all learn a lot from Aislinn, so take it away, Aislinn. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you. I think this moment is, crystallizing even more clearly for those of us who have already been supporters of the Cuban Revolution and advocates for ending the blockade, and hopefully for others around the world at identifying the huge juxtaposition between what is existing here in the United States in relation to this health crisis, as well as the political crisis that I think we're just seeing the very tip of the iceberg on in relation to the coronavirus. At this moment, the juxtaposition could not be wider. The United States, who has continued detentioning migrant workers, has threatened to suspend the Constitution during the pandemic. The president, who last Friday, exactly just over a week ago, who held a press conference in relation to the coronavirus and did it with CEOs of some of the globe's largest companies, including Walmart, Walgreens, Target, private pharmaceutical industries, instead of medical experts, epidemiologists, and scientists, all glaringly reveal the diametrically opposed positioning that the United States has been taking with relation to this pandemic. And what we're seeing is that the program that is this country, its ideological and political and economic system is playing out exactly in the way that it is designed. We're seeing the billionaires coming forward and the defenses and the bailouts happening to them. The Federal Reserve, I think, as previously mentioned on this call, issued a $1.5 trillion bailout a little over a week ago, followed that up by another billion, $1.5 trillion bailout, and then followed it up with another billion bailout, and now is offering large banks $1.5 trillion loans a day through the end of this month, in which we can assume will probably continue beyond the end of this month. Instead of what we need, which is the immediate lifting of the blockade against Cuba, the interferon alpha 2b retroviral that Howard mentioned at the top of this is being used to treat the coronavirus all over the world. And it's because of the blockade that we will not have access to it here in the United States. And so on top of having a private healthcare industry that is not organized nor intended to treat the public health issues of this country, we will be prevented from having contact with and having resource of and use of medicine that is being used to treat the coronavirus across the globe. Instead of $1.5 trillion injection into our infrastructure, into rebuilding our public health care system, which has been decimated over the past 30 and 40 years in the United States, and which is now virtually completely privatized. We need to have mass production of the N95 masks that our medical professionals need to have in order to care for our population as this pandemic increases. 3M, Procter and Gamble, all of these other huge capitalist corporations need to be forced into producing these materials that our medical professionals on the front line are going to be needing and that are facing short supply right now. We need to immediately enact the Army Corps of Engineers to build thousands of hospitals, tens of thousands, if not millions of hospitals over the course of this pandemic across the country. Other measures that have been taking place across the globe include police officers in China and in South Korea transporting groceries to quarantine families. That's an actual great use of the police that we could have here. And in Chicago, where we have one of the largest police forces in the country, could actually be a good use of them, and they should be put to use in order to provide the emergency necessities that we'll need in the coming weeks as this pandemic increases. The United States has a population of 329 million people. As of this writing, as of yesterday, actually on March 21st, the United States has tested approximately 182,000 people, with over 23,000 testing positive. By comparison, South Korea, with a population of 51.47 million, has been testing 20,000 people a day. The United States is drastically lagging behind the rest of the world with access to kits. Trump refused the World Health Organization's offer of providing tests to the United States. And therefore, the true rate and the true magnitude of this pandemic remains illusory. It remains fragmented, and we actually don't have the real numbers. A personal friend of mine who has been involved in this work for decades and was the cousin of Emmett Till, passed away yesterday. And the community here in Chicago is very, very saddened. And we know that she was not sick a week ago. We don't know what actually caused her death because our hospitals already are being taxed by this pandemic. The lack of a public healthcare system and the lack of an infrastructure capable of carrying out what's needed further handicaps the ability to wage a concerted emergency health effort to treat the population. In the hands of the private healthcare industry, the results of these tests are uncoordinated, are minimal, and therefore we're left with huge inaccuracies. Because we have a patchwork medical system as opposed to a universal medical system under a revolutionary government like in Cuba, we are handicapped by the spread of this communicable disease threat. And the system that we have, motivating engine, is not the health of the public, but is of their profit margin. Our system focuses on the immediate needs of insured patients rather than treating the overall disease as a public emergency. And thus, we are further handicapped by containment and treatment. And so what we're seeing is not just a healthcare crisis in this country that is playing out, but we're also seeing the political crisis that is the consequence of capitalism. And unfortunately, that means that many more people are going to die as a direct result of this system. The Black Lives Matter Global Network was able to come together a little less than a week ago and submit a unified statement of from all the chapters, in which our very first demand is to immediately remove the blockade against Cuba. This is now more critical than ever. The threat to our lives, the threat to humanity, and the threat to the globe, as exemplified by Mildred's comments, should be clearer now than at any point in time in our lives. We need immediate funding to allow for massive testing all over, and this testing needs to be free. There needs to be emergency access to shelter all unhoused, all homeless people, all poor folks. There needs to be immediate testing and release of inmates, those incarcerated who are elderly as well as infirm. All SNAP benefits need to be expanded. Unemployment benefits need to be expanded. And last but not least, we absolutely need a universal healthcare system that protects the public health. And we need to use this moment of crisis and this moment of pending death that we know is coming to mobilize and radicalize this population in emulating the example of the Cuban people and transforming our society into one that is organized around saving the life of all humanity and the life of all of living beings on this planet, and not around the lust and the greed of a tiny few wealthy billionaires.
Wow, that was a great way to end our panel. And I shouldn't say end because it's just the beginning, I think, of expanding and deepening our movement. And now we're going to move to questions and answers with John doing the moderation. Yeah. And I just like kind of like 1 minute at the end, John, before we finish. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Howard. One thing I want to announce before we get on to questions and answers, something that came up in the panel yesterday, and many of you on today may not have been on that panel yesterday, is that as of Friday, Cuba started to take more control of its borders and airports. And so that starting from March 24th, for a month, it won't be possible for US citizens to fly to Cuba, or people from anywhere in the world to fly to Cuba, unless you are Cuban citizens or you are have a Cuban residency. And we wait and see what will happen after that month. But I wanted to make that clear. Those questions, I'm conscious that there's several graduates from the Latin American School of Medicine on this call, US graduates who are trained for free in Cuba to become doctors. And there is a question for them, which is a question, it's also a challenge. How can you use your knowledge, your position, to speak out about this crisis and to speak in situations online for now, later publicly, events, to publicize what Cuba could offer the US in terms of medical care and management of the crisis? So I invite any of the ELAM grads who are accessible to respond to that question.
My name is Christine.
So Lillian or Dante, do you want to unmute yourself and respond?
Do you all hear me?
Yeah, Christine is starting to speak.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So my name is Christine Knight. I have graduated from ALAM this July of 2019. First, I want to say thank you to everyone for inviting us to participate and for the great information you all have shared with us. Yeah, so I think as we all are seeing in this current moment, and what I would argue we have been seeing for most of our lives living in the US, there are a lot of infrastructural issues within the US medical care system, and outside of that, that do not put, human lives at the center of care. And so I think that in this moment, it is important to highlight systems and learn from systems that do that, and to find ways to take those lessons and implement them into the work that we do within our own context. I think that we do have different examples of that, especially here in Chicago. We do have an experience where Cuban, it's called MINSAP. It's like the health ministry has been invited to Chicago to talk about ways to implement tools that are used in the Cuban system, such as comprehensive health analyses of communities, and finding ways to like most efficiently and effectively utilize our health resources towards a broader application of care for all people within our communities. I think what that programming found, and I think what we just have found as conversing as Alam graduates, is that it is hard to take some of these lessons that we are learning from Cuba and implement them into the US, because we do have so many other infrastructural issues. And I just was teleconferencing in on a conversation with people working on, primary care as an infrastructure in the US. And, they said in the US, we spend 3.4% of our budget on primary care. So I think so. And I'm sorry, I'm not trying to say all these things to be pessimistic. I think what I'm trying to say is that we do need to recognize that we have lessons and we are learning tools from the Cuban system, but we really kind of have to come together and kind of think about ways to creatively incorporate them into our communities, recognizing that our communities do not have the same infrastructure as that exists within Cuba. And that's going to take a certain level of creativity and a certain level of, like, even what we are doing here, information sharing and mobilizing in order to understand the resources that we do have and how to best use them. And so I think the role that like Alam graduates have in this moment is that, and within that work, is that we have been gifted kind of an incredible skill set that I think that as we work and as we can slowly work our way into what is the actual level, because it's one level of being a clinician, it's another level of kind of being able to incorporate ourselves into policy changing and like infrastructure building within our system. I think as we kind of move into that sector, that's when we have to start utilizing these skills. But in the meantime, I think a lot of what we are doing is significant, and I think that in terms of how we are doing now, we need to get this information out there first and foremost, and from there hopefully start, because it's going to require pretty significant infrastructural change for sure.
Okay, thank you, Christine. Question that came up yesterday and has been put. We didn't get a chance to go to it, but it's come up again today. I'm not sure who best could answer this, but there's a question from a worker co-op in New York about how worker co-ops in New York State and in the US could make contact and support and learn from the cooperative movement in Cuba. Anybody feel they can?
This is Howard.
Okay.
I welcome other people to try and answer this question. I think that's a great question. I would start off by going to the monthly review and look up Cuban cooperatives. There's several good articles written there that really explain the basis of Cuban cooperatives and also explain the basis of how cooperatives function differently under socialism than under capitalism. But if people want to send me their contact information, I'd be happy to put you in touch with some of those cooperatives. I think probably most people know that, for example, in terms of rural farming in Cuba, 80% of all food that is grown is now under rural cooperatives. That's not part of the government structure. It's a major change since the special period began.
Thank you, Howard. Anybody else want to add into this, or shall I move on to the next question?
I just wanted to say, in the meantime, Puerto Rico's economy was switched from industrial to agriculture, from agriculture to industrial, and now 85% of the food is imported from the United States. So we could, it would be great if we had the co-ops and I could learn more. I'll give you my email, Howard. You should have it, right?
Okay, thank you, Millie. Moving on, next question, which is about education, addressed to Malcolm. Can you clarify or answer what aspects of Cuba's education system you think could be best utilized here in the United States?
Well, I think there's the principles of equality and the commitment to public education for all, the valuing of all students equally, which is a far cry from what we have here. But I think going back to my remarks, I would say, you know, the example of Cuba in mobilizing youth to teach adult literacy could be recreated on a small scale, on a community level in localities across the US. When I've spoken to young people about this, it's something that excites them. They're aware of this issue and the barriers that it creates for them and their families. So I think, you know, if educators can be organized together with students, the kind of literacy brigades that happened in Cuba, although it wouldn't be a national program without a revolution, could be implemented on a small scale, community by community.
Okay, thank you, Malcolm. I just want to come back to the question on co-ops. I've been asked to mention that the National Association of Co-ops could be pressurized to demand an end to the blockade. That's a national association in the US. Question now for Ramon. I don't know whether you'll have an answer to this, but questioner was pointing out that in Iran, which is very badly hit by the coronavirus crisis, they have made steps to release people from prison. Do you know if Cuba is contemplating that, or?
I'm not sure if Cuba is contemplating that now. I haven't had time to look into it. I do know that in Connecticut, there has just been some talk about that, but it's been very, very silent. So I know that that's not something, at least, that's you know, that at least it's become known, or it's something that's being pushed, at least in the state of Connecticut, and maybe even in other states as well.
Okay, thank you, Ramon. Question now from South Africa, which is, they're saying that they in South Africa have done a lot of protests at the United States Embassy and handed in petitions, but they think that these petitions never reach the US, they just get thrown away. And they're wondering what solidarity movements around the world in South Africa, I'm sure we've got people on this call from Canada and Quebec, what can they do to put pressure, add to the pressure on Congress to finally lift the blockade? Anybody like to attempt answer to that?
Revolution.
I'm sorry, John, could you mind repeating the question one more time?
They want to know is that for people, solidarity movements elsewhere in the world, like South Africa, or like Canada, Quebec, wherever, what can they do to help us in the US put pressure on Congress to lift the blockade?
I think that one of, I think regardless of whether or not a political body looks at the petitions is not really as important as mobilizing and getting thousands of people or hundreds or however many people it is who are being informed, talked to about Cuba and about the role of the United States, and continuing to mobilize and organize to spread that is important wherever you are in the world. And that acts much like, and I believe this question was from South Africa, much like the global anti-apartheid movements occurred. That was important, right? It was important to continue to get the story of the revolution out, the example of the revolution out, and building an international body that's capable of organizing and taking to the streets. I think there can be specific asks, like I think yesterday, Gail, I believe, was mentioning about the need to, legislation is needed in order to remove the Helms-Burton Act. So that's a concrete thing that can be looked into. But aside from the details of, where legislation exists, where it's stalled, helping to build the larger political pressure that forces the crisis to happen is what is always helpful. In the United States, seeing thousands of people protesting U.S. embassies is important for the people here in this country to see that the actions of this government are not being willingly accepted, but are actually being organized against. That's important. That in and of itself is a mobilizing factor for people here in the United States.
Thank you, Iselin. I want to move on to a question about Cuba's medical achievements. People are wondering, how can we make the existence of interferon alpha 2b as a drug to fight the virus? How can we make that knowledge available to people in the US? How can we push, whether it be federal government or state government or health officials, to reach out to Cuba and ask for their cooperation in combating the virus?
Why can't we all demand it and talk to the representatives, like call them and visit them and tell them and demand that we need this? They can't allow us to die because they're not letting us have this medication that exists. So I was just thinking, putting more pressure on those politicians.
So I just kind of want to explain just briefly. So Cuba invented the interferon alpha 2b in 1986, as the ambassador mentioned yesterday. Then in 2003, they built a factory in China that's a joint factory of the revolutionary Cuban government with the People's Republic of China. That's why China had the medicine so available. This is not a cure-all medicine. It's not a vaccine. The Chinese used about 30 different medical combinations that included multiple drugs, and interferon was certainly one of them that was important. The way it works is to basically slow down the replication of the virus to give the body's own immune system a chance. It's only used primarily on patients who are near the end of their life when kind of other things fail. There's not a direct medicine, as everybody knows, or vaccine yet for coronavirus. So it was successful with these other medicines. I think it's a great thing to raise right now so that people then are aware that it's this medicine, and even as important or more important are the other medicines that we talked about, Simivax, Ibuprofen, whatever, as a way to bring down the blockade.
Thank you, Howard. I want to read out a comment that came on the question and answer, just because I think it's interesting. I don't know whether it says, is it possible to produce a video statement from the Cubans to the American people offering their assistance in combating the health crisis and the need for collaboration worldwide? we could then send it out widely, and I think it would get a great following. So I'm not asking for responses on that. I'm just wanting to share that with everybody. Okay, moving on. So a number of you have referred, I think Howard, but maybe others in your presentations about the role of Cuban mass organizations like the CDR. And the question is, the US society isn't used to those kind of organizations. Do you think there would be barriers in trying to persuade them that such organizations have a value, and how would you overcome that?
I'd kind of like to respectfully disagree with a number of the chat comments, and actually with some of the people on the call and panel. I have a great faith in humanity. I think if we don't have faith in humanity, we wouldn't be here after 350,000 years. When I used to teach at various universities, including the one I'm still at, University of Illinois, as a retired faculty member, I'd ask the students, what do you think we did as people for 350,000 years? Did we fight most of the time, or did we get along? Obviously, if we fought most of the time, we wouldn't be here. So I just want to give two examples of what has existed in our country within the last 100 years. In 1930, the Communist Party and various other members of the United Front formed unemployment councils all over this country, which within 1 month had 50,000 members. At that point, only about 15% of the people had telephones, and yet in every city and town in the United States, dozens, sometimes hundreds of people would show up to fight the sheriff on evictions, and if the person had been evicted, they would immediately put the furniture back in the home and surround the home. I could go on about this, but that's a real example that existed. People used to designate runners on every block. It would run from one block to another to alert people to evictions, and they did a lot of other things. In 1969, Fred Hampton, as I mentioned, initiated, with the help of the Young Lords and other groups, the Young Patriots, American Indian Movement, the Rainbow Coalition here in Chicago. Within months, hundreds of us were out in the communities, knocking on people's doors, working with people to do their own kind of organizing around the kind of things we're talking about now. Now, I know that a lot of that hasn't happened recently, but as I said, there's thousands of people right now doing mutual aid and solidarity. Now, it's not clear what their view is in terms of what to do besides deliver food and medicines, which is important. And I think we all think we need to do more than that. But I just want to say, yes, we have not had a revolution. We're not close to a revolution, but we have to seize this moment, to basically talk about what can we do right now and how is that going to lead us to revolution? Because we have a real opportunity right now that we would be really amiss to pass on. And I have tremendous faith in the majority of American people. I just want to finish by saying about 10 of us handed out leaflets in our area of Chicago on Thursday, Friday, and yesterday. We tried to, of course, stay 3 to 6 feet away, but we did give people leaflets. These were on resources and demands for Chicago, which are very similar all over the country. People were incredibly responsive. They all said, yes, we have to do things. Dozens of them said, yes, we'll take responsibility for our block. So I just want to say, I think that we have a great opportunity here, and I'm confident that we can do this.
I wanted to, I wanted to also follow up on what was mentioning, and unfortunately, I just couldn't really get to this part concerning the CDRs in my presentation because of time. The part that I couldn't get to it, I specifically spoke about or want to speak about this. The long and short of it is, when I was in the Civilian Police Review Board, I felt that we were doing a very good job. Were sort of pushed out by the sort of elected power officials, and so right in council and between council and some council members and the mayor to sort of retain the Civilian Police Review Board, all were pushed out but me. And they really tried hard, but unfortunately they just couldn't sort of overcome the ruling power, sort of the power elite in the city. And there was community organizing. There were community organizers that came out and spoke on behalf of the board members that were booted out. I wasn't booted out at that time, but I spoke in their favor. And so the problem was that it just didn't have enough community support. And part of it was because, as I mentioned, at least in Hartford, most people are, it's a poor city. A lot of people don't really understand city government, don't understand community organizing. They're busy sort of surviving and trying to sort of care to their families. So, and I personally think the CDRs, one of my points was that they do a phenomenal job based on the that I found on sort of, at least with the incarcerated population, to sort of help them find work, help them get set up with families, inform people about how their local government works, the importance of getting involved. And we don't really have that in Hartford, and I would think that that happens nationally. So we have to sort of really learn how these CDRs work, and that's would be a great thing about traveling there and seeing what we could implement here. And to mention Howard, we need to revive that, and we need to sort of really, for lack of a better term, hit the streets, talk to our neighbors, start organizing, become informed, learn from the Cuban system and from other systems in order to sort of ignite real change. Because I think it's possible, but I think it's going to be an extremely difficult fight. And I'm speaking from experience. I've worked in elections, I've worked in community issues, and it's very, very difficult to organize working class people and especially indigent people to sort of really push for needed change.
Can I just jump in real quick? I just wanted to kind of underscore some of the points that Howard was making regarding the possibilities that exist in this moment. Though dire, though we know that, that capitalism, and particularly in the United States, capitalism is not equipped nor set up to deal with any kind of public health crises. What we are seeing is really important. So the on the ground mobilizations that have happened in the span of days include people checking up on their neighbors. And we saw reports of this happening in Puerto Rico, where again, the government failed and there was no interaction, and people taking up and creating systems to ensure that elderly folks are checked on, that groceries are being delivered. Young folks have been doing that in Chicago, targeting the South Sides and the West Sides, where we have food deserts, and we've seen this happen routinely when there have been crises occur. We saw this in Ferguson, where there were round-the-clock organizers who were around the clock encamping and watching the police station, organizers who slept out on the streets, and people would bring them food and invite them in to use the bathroom. We've seen that in strikes where the community comes together and takes care of each other. And I think that in this moment, we can see again that the power of humanity is still shining bright, and we can even in the dire circumstances that we're in, where we should take precaution and we should be sheltering in place, and those of us with compromised immune systems should be listening. There's still things that are happening that are important to point out as indicative of our true power, right? And our power, just like the power of the Cuban people, is to create a world in which suffering is not engineered, and suffering is not manufactured and exploited for profit, but a world in which we can create one where all of us can live, and where our health and lives can be nurtured. And it's everyday folks, working class folks, putting their lives on the line in order to care for each other. That is who is giving us hope and giving me hope in this moment, and are the people who have always had the power to transform society and to transform the world, and will be the ones who will emulate the Cubans in bringing forth change here.
John, you're muted.
You're muted, John.
Thank you. Thank you, Iceland. We're running out of time for this webinar, so I'm going to want to close with having several people, including myself, making some statements. But I'd like to ask Cheryl to come in and explain how people can access in the recording of this webinar and the one from yesterday as well, and also about the website. So Cheryl, can you come in?
Yeah, let me see. Hi, everybody. Both the webinar yesterday and the webinar today have been live streamed to the website of the National Network on Cuba. It is NNOC, oh, wait a minute, the Facebook page. It's Cuba Network, Facebook/Cuba Network. And you can watch the video there. We will be uploading it to YouTube, and it will be posted at the website of the organizing for the conference that was postponed this weekend. That website is us-cubanormalization.org. That's us-cubanormalization.org, all one word. So all of the resources that have been presented over these 2 days will be posted there and more. Plus, there will be other events like this, bringing together people from all across the country that are so exciting to hear everybody and see everybody, and you know, it shows that the struggle to end the blockade is alive and well. They can, you know, shut down a lot of things, but they can't shut down our struggle. Also, if people use Twitter, we can contact elected representatives that way. We can initiate activities that way. I agree with everything that was said, that Aislinn said, and also that Howard said, that we need to reestablish those old ways of communicating and struggling together. But this is also a good thing too.
Okay, thank you, Cheryl. I want to say a few words from me now, that the webinar today and the webinar yesterday were to replace what we'd originally intended would be a live in-person conference in New York about US-Cuba relations. That had to be postponed because of the coronavirus crisis. Our intention is to organize that conference again, assuming things are somewhat more back to normal, in November, the weekend of November the 13th to the 15th in New York. So that's the current plan. I also want to add that, as well as what will be on the website and on the Facebook page, participants in these two webinars will, in the coming days, be receiving emails with some resource documents. Certainly one document about travel to Cuba in the current situation, another document about a toolkit of how to lobby effectively to state and local governments, city governments, to pass resolutions to end the blockade. There may be other documents we'll be sending out. So I want to now finally hand over to Howard as the moderator for today to have the final words to say before we end the session.
Thank you so much, John, Cheryl, Gail, and everybody else who helped pull this together. We all really appreciate it. I just want to make people aware of the fact that the National Network on Cuba has existed for decades. I believe there's 25 chapters in Canada and the United States. I would really encourage all of you to go to the website where there are links with most or all of the chapters, and to begin to work with us wherever you live, to take what we did in this panel and what we learned yesterday and start putting it into practice where we live. I'm going to give a charge now to Cheryl and Gail, who are two of the 5 co-chairs of NNOC, that we need to take all the wonderful people who were here the last 2 days and use it right now to extend the work of NNOC, to extend the work of Pastors for Peace and IFCO, and to begin to work with all of our allies everywhere, in every city, in every county, in every state in this country, to begin to put into practice some of what we were just talking about. And I just want to reemphasize one point, and then I'll sign off. Because of the way the federal government was originally organized under the Constitution of the United States, the CDC has almost no power over any state or local health department. The only power it has, you can see this on its website right now, is the power of quarantine, only under special circumstances, with the signing off, obviously, the President of the United States. All other things are under the power of the state, all 50 state governments and most large city governments, who have what are called police powers. This was started at the end of the 19th century, and it still exists. Excuse me for coughing. It still exists, and what this means is that the ELAM grads that are on this call, and basically tens of thousands of health science students, could be deputized at this very moment and paid and trained and certified to do various types of work that now Italy, the United Kingdom, France, and other countries have started doing the last 2 weeks. That means community work that takes some of the things we learned from Cuba and applies them. It means relieving the thousands, soon to be tens of thousands of health workers who don't have PPE and N95 masks, they're getting sick. They know they're spreading the disease to the patients. So this exists right now. It's been encoded in law for over 125 years. And this is one particular thing in the context of which we can raise other things that we can do with the existing community organizations, with the existing organizations and social movements like Black Lives Matter, and through the existing NNOC. So thank you very much, everyone. We look forward to seeing you tonight. If you can join us, it's 8:30 Eastern Time, 7:30 Central Time, 6:30 Mountain Time, and 5:30 Pacific Time. Thank you all very much. Y venceremos.
Okay, I'll say again, thank you to all. Gail Walker from IFCO has just sent out on the chat, thanking all the panelists for their attendance. And I'll repeat what she wrote there. Let's all go forth. Sorry? Let's all go forth and continue our efforts to work for an end to the commercial and economic blockade of Cuba, as well as the pervasive information blockade. So thank you all for attending, and I'm now going to end the meeting.
¡Que viva Cuba Libre! ¡Viva!
¡Que viva!